Welcome, everyone. We are in our second session of our watercolor series. So we did a flat wash and glazing. These were the two techniques we focused on last to help create some wonderful abstract art, right? We talked about layering out, practicing that flat wash, which is a smooth color. There's no variation. And the technique is basically a wet on dry. So it's a wet brush on dry paper. And then we talked a little bit about glazing, which is layering on top of an already dried painted space. And so we kind of played with that a little bit. Hopefully you've had some time during the week maybe to kind of play around with some more flat washes and glazing. It can be a really fun and soothing process. I know like what we're doing today is one of my favorite watercolor techniques that I do quite often because it feels good. It doesn't have to look like anything specifically. It's just something that feels good when I get to sit down and do it. So that's kind of what we focused on last. Today, we're going to focus on a wet on wet process. So if you were in Intro to Watercolor 1, this will be a little bit of a refresher in the beginning, but we're going to kind of play around with it today. Let's go ahead and talk over some of the supplies that we're going to be using today. So first, our watercolor. Whatever kind of watercolor you have will work for our process today. I'll be demoing with two types, a pan palette that comes already with the colors in it, and I'll also be demoing with a watercolor palette that I used tubes of pigment. I created my own color palette. So I'll be demoing with both of those today just to illustrate that you can create paintings with either source, right? We'll also need our brush today. And again, I'll be demoing with a couple different types. I have a round brush and a flat brush that came from a pan palette. Most likely, if you're using a pan palette, you have a round brush that came with it. That's the most versatile brush. So that's a good one to work with. But sometimes they come with flat brushes. Know that whichever brush you have, it will work for our process today for sure. I'm also going to be demoing with a couple brushes that didn't come in a kit that I bought separately. And so again, it's just going to be a round brush and a flat brush. All right, so we need our watercolors, we need our brush, we need our paper. I'm going to be using some watercolor paper today, but you can also use some mixed media paper. The thicker the paper, the better it holds up to the water, especially with the process we're doing today. So I'm going to be using some watercolor paper. We'll also need 2 cups of water. One is to clean our brush, and the other is to add clean water to our paper and clean water to our pigment. So we need those 2 water sources today. We'll also need a rag or paper towel. And this is just to kind of help us clean our brush in between colors. All right, so those are supplies that we need for today, those basic watercolor supplies. Because we're focusing on the wet on wet technique, we're going to also talk about a few other supplies that are not typically seen as watercolor supplies. We're going to talk about how to incorporate them into our painting to really change the look. Just really quickly, I want to go over those. So if you do want to follow along and use some of these unconventional supplies, we'll take just a moment so you can go gather them. The first one is a little bit of rice. So I've got here just a little rice that I'm going to be using in a cup, and it can be any type of rice. I think what I have here is like a mix of long grain and sushi rice. So whatever kind of rice you have will work. We just need a little bit. Also, some table salt. I've got little packs of salt, but you can take that salt shaker right out of the kitchen and use that for our process today. I'll be using a piece of saran wrap or cling wrap, that plastic wrap that's kind of sticky, not sticky, but sticks to itself pretty easily. We're going to be using a piece of that today. And a little bit of rubbing alcohol. Now I know these are 4 random supplies, so I'll go back over them in just a second, but we're going to be using a little bit of rubbing alcohol today. We'll be using a piece of the cling wrap or saran wrap. We'll use a little bit of table salt. It's a little bit of rice. Nothing super fancy. It doesn't matter what type, like percentage isopropyl alcohol you're using, whether it's the 75%, 70%, 91%, that doesn't matter. Just that rubbing alcohol that you keep in your medicine cabinet or in your bathroom. That's perfect for what we're going to be using today. So let's start off. I want to talk a little bit about the wet on wet process. Like I said, and if you were with us in our watercolor intro to watercolor 1, we spent a little time on that process. I'm going to pull out my little card here to kind of show as an example of what wet on wet can look like. Wet on wet is basically a wet brush on wet paper, right? And so we can see in the example here, you can see where the pigment is pooling, right? It's more concentrated. You can see where it's lighter. You get quite a variety of value in our color here because some places have more water than others, right? More pigment. It's different from that flat wash. The flat wash is the wet on dry, where it's that smooth application of color, right? There's no variation like we see with the wet on wet. Okay? The flat wash is what we focused on in our last session. So today we're going to spend some time with that wet on wet. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of walk through our process. If you haven't already, let's go ahead and activate our watercolor. I've just got a little spray bottle of water, and I'm just going to kind of spray my pigment. If you don't have a little bottle of water, spray bottle of water, you can use a dropper or even your brush to transfer water to your pigment. But again, the reason we do this is to activate that pigment. While the water sits there, it kind of pulls up that pigment so we get a more concentrated, bolder look. All right. So the wet on wet process is really about kind of painting with water before we paint with pigment. So I'm going to, for this, to start off, and again, if you have your brush and pigment with you, go ahead and follow along with me now. But what we're going to do is paint our surface with water before we add that pigment in there. That water acts differently, right? That pigment is going to go wherever that water is. When we're doing the wet on dry, that water is in a very specific place. That pigment only stays right there where we painted. But when we're doing that wet on wet, that pigment kind of goes everywhere because the water is covering a larger surface, right? So I'm going to go ahead, I'm taking my brush. I'm just using a flat brush right now, but I'm going to get my brush wet. I'm going to kind of paint just a little square with the water. We don't want the water to be kind of runny, but we want to make sure that the paper is pretty saturated. It's staying in kind of a square-ish space. So I've got, I know it's hard to see because water is clear, but I have a little square right here that is covered in water. So my next step is to take my brush, and I'm going to do red. I think red will be a little easy to see on camera. I'm just going to kind of get my brush covered in that pigment. And I'm just going to kind of demo a couple ways we can fill the space. We can do it either by making a brush stroke, and you can see how the water is taking that pigment, right? It's not staying in that one brush stroke, it's spreading out, right? That water is taking the pigment for me. I don't have to move it. So we can do a brush stroke, or we can do a tapping. And tapping is just kind of like putting that brush down in the same spot. So I'm making kind of a dot. It's really concentrated in color in the center, but we can see that water is pulling that pigment out, right? I mentioned earlier, this is my favorite watercolor process to do because I feel like it's so freeing because the water is really doing all the work for me. I'm just putting the pigment there. So the water takes it and kind of runs with it. This process can be a really relaxing, soothing process. We can see even now that that brush stroke that I made no longer looks like a brush stroke because that water is taking that pigment out. And that dot that I made, I tapped it several times. It's spreading out too. So it's no longer that little dot, right? It's spreading out and it's becoming less concentrated, right? So if I want to make that dot brighter, right? I want it to be more red, more concentrated. What I can do is get my brush wet and go back in with some more of that pigment and tap in that same space. And so you can see it's more concentrated, right? It's brighter in color. We can see it's less concentrated the further out it goes. You can also change color. I'm going to clean my brush really quickly. So I'm going to get my brush wet and I'm going to bring in some blue here. So you can kind of see that even though I've got red here, if I add another color in, say tap another color or do a brush stroke, you can see that the water, clean that out. You can see that the water is doing some really nice blending for me. I just did a stroke and already that blue stroke is mixing with the red. So I'm getting a really nice purple blend, right? I didn't have to mix it. The water naturally did that for me. And we can see even where I was tapping that water is really pulling that pigment out, right? This is a really wonderful technique to use with abstract painting, right? Because you're not doing anything representational. You're not doing really anything. You're letting the water do all of it. And it feels good, right? So this is that wet on wet technique. These are a couple ways you can do that by doing that brush stroke or doing the tapping. And again, the part I want to emphasize is that we're painting with water before we paint with pigment. Now, as you're kind of doing the wet on wet technique, you may find that the water is not pulling that pigment. Maybe the pigment is not spreading out as much as you want it to. And that could mean that the paper is starting to dry a little bit. And so one way around that, I'm going to use a round brush here. One way to kind of make it spread a little more is to take your brush, whoop, put it in the wrong one, put it in the clean water. Take your brush and add just water to it, right? And that water, by adding that water, you can see it's starting to take that pigment again, right? And so the main thing to keep in mind when we're doing wet on wet, the main thing to keep in mind is that we need a lot of water for this. Right? And so this is just a kind of a little example of our wet on wet technique. So what I want to kind of transition to now is taking what we just did and bringing in some unconventional supplies. I love bringing in all these outside supplies that you typically don't think of as art supplies because they can really add some nice texture, design, color to your piece. I'm going to show a couple examples I have here that I did earlier. So you can kind of see the patterning and design that comes from these different supplies that we talked about. So this is just that wet on wet technique. I did two colors, kind of a mustardy color and like a burnt red, a rusty color. And I didn't add anything to it. It was just the water and the pigment. For rice, you can see where the rice is soaking some of that water up, and you get this really fun patterning that shows up with that rice. That rice soaks up the moisture, and so it helps it dry faster, right? But it also leaves this kind of fun design. Here's an example of the salt. While it's still wet, you want to add these different materials. But that salt brings this beautiful, like crystallized pattern. That salt, again, it helps soak up the moisture. So it's just a collection of pigment. And you get this really wonderful patterning that comes from that salt. With the cling wrap, I think this is just a really fun design that you get. So cling wrap, when we press the cling wrap into it, that saran wrap, you get this really nice design because wherever that cling wrap is pressed, it takes a little longer to dry. And so you can see these really wonderful designs that show up. And then the last way we're going to kind of walk through today is using that rubbing alcohol. And you can see that rubbing alcohol is a way of drying things really quickly. And so you get these really wonderful kind of circular patterns that come from it. So we're going to kind of play around with some of these today. Know that this is not these are not the only supplies you can use. You can use anything that's kind of absorbent. I've used like yarn one time to soak up moisture, and it created this really fun pattern. You can be creative with some of those supplies that we use to add to it. So let's go ahead and start off by just painting with water. We're going to do one at a time because we want to make sure we have a lot of water on our paper so we can add that pigment to it. And so I'm going to use a round brush today. I'm going to use a round brush, and I'm going to start off by painting with my clean water, right? Getting my brush wet and then just painting. I'm just going to do like a little square today. And again, we want a lot of water on that space, but we don't want it to be runny. Okay. So now that I have that clear space, right, that clear square of water, I'm going to go over to my green here, and I'm going to get some green pigment and just do a couple strokes in there, adding that color. And as we're adding color to our piece today, I would encourage you to think about your color choices too. Last week we talked about different combinations of colors. And so like it's kind of fun to think about too. Do I feel more like green today? Or do I feel more yellow? That's a fun way to think about it. Or do we want to make colors that really pop? We can use the complementary colors to really pop our painting today. So I'm just going to kind of go through and just add some pigment. Doing this technique, sometimes our painting can get a little muddy. That's kind of like one of the downsides to this process is that there's too much blending and you get this muddy kind of painting. One way to kind of prevent it from getting muddy is by kind of narrowing down our color choices. So sticking with 2 to 4 colors. When we start adding a whole bunch of colors in there, it's easier for it to all blend and mix together and get muddy. So staying with like 2 or 3 colors is kind of a good way to go here. So I'm just kind of tapping some color in here. Adding a little color to my painting, and where I want the bolder color, the more concentrated color, I'm tapping it a couple times to make it a darker color. So I'm going to start off. I just added some color here. My painting is still really wet, which is good. We want to put these additives on while it's wet. So if your painting is still wet, great. If it's starting to dry a little bit, what I'd recommend is just going and taking some of the clear water, get it on your brush, and just kind of tap with the clear water, right? It kind of wets that paper again. So now that it's wet, we're going to start off by adding some rice. So we can kind of see how that looks. So I'm just going to put rice in my hand. Again, this is uncooked rice, and it doesn't matter the type of rice. Rice is really absorbent, and so it's going to soak up a lot of that water. And so hopefully as you're adding rice to your piece, right, you can see it start to soak up some of the water, and it's already creating kind of a fun pattern. Now, watercolor is definitely a slow process because you're waiting for the water to dry, right? And so that rice does 2 things. It helps that painting dry faster, right? Because it's soaking up that moisture, that water. And it's also creating this really fun pattern, right? So let's go ahead. If you've done your rice, let's go ahead and do another square. We'll talk about some salt now. So I'm going to take my brush, get it nice and wet. And again, we're painting with water first. That wet on wet process, we paint with water and then we paint with our pigment. I'm just adding water to a little square here. And we don't want it runny, right? But we want there to be some, I guess, standing water, I guess. So we want it to be nice and wet. So now that I have a lot of water on here, I'm going to start bringing my colors in. And I'm going to do yellow to start. Now, when it comes to watercolor painting, I know we talked a little bit about it last time and in our Intro to Watercolor 1, but you want to start with your lightest color. So I'm always starting with my lightest color. Here, it's yellow. The reason we start with the lightest color is because you can paint a darker color on top of the lighter color, but you can't paint that lighter color on top of a darker color. So it's good to do that lighter color first and get it kind of covering the spaces. And you can see as I'm tapping, as I'm adding the pigment, I'm not completely covering the whole space. I'm doing kind of a smaller part, right? And it's so when I add other colors to it, I can still get some of that original color as well as some blending. So it does something like this, right? In our first one, I have some blue, but where that blue overlaps the red, I'm getting some nice purple. But I still like having that little bit of true blue there. And so I'm painting that on a space where there's no other color, right? So I can see that the water is pulling that yellow a little bit, but not a whole lot. So I'm going to add a little more water to my painting here, just so it can help pull that pigment out. Okay. Then I'm going to add some more color. I'm going to add some green, I think. I'm just kind of building it up, layering, right? I'm not completely starting where I did the yellow, but I'm just kind of adding that green pigment. Building it up. I'm going to do about three colors here. Add some, I'm going to do red. So you can see again, that water is covering that space and it's taking that pigment. Now I'm going to go ahead and pull the salt out because I'm going to add salt to this one. But I'm going to hop back really quickly. That rice, you may notice, I've still got my rice there. It's still soaking up. We want to leave that there until it dries, right? As I was saying before, that watercolor painting is not a fast process. It's slow, a slow process. And so it's kind of nice to be kind of forced almost to slow down with this process. And so there's a lot of waiting time. And I will say when I do watercolor, I usually have two paintings that I'm working on at the same time. So I can work on one, and then while that's drying, I can work on the other one and kind of go back and forth. It's kind of the fun thing about watercolor. We're not leaving the rice on it or the salt on it forever. We're just kind of doing it until it dries. And so I'm sprinkling salt on my painting. I'm not covering it. I'm laying just enough salt on there, kind of like I'm salting a baked potato. Not a whole lot of it, but just enough to kind of cover it. And hopefully you can see as you're adding that salt, you can start to see it soaking up some of that water. Again, you don't need a whole lot, but you can put a lot on there. It's just a little bit makes a big difference, right? And so you can see that salt is already starting to kind of fill in that space. All right, so let's do another wet on wet painting. So I'm gonna paint with water first. So I've got a flat brush I'm using here. Again, I'm just gonna paint a little square. Okay. I don't want the runny water. I just want um, enough water to carry that pigment. And it may take a minute or two. It may take a little while to figure out how much water that is. Right? So I've painted with water. Now I'm going to bring my color in. And I'm going to do, again, the lightest color first. And so I'm going to do yellow. So I'm going to hop back to my pan palette here. Make sure my brush is nice and wet. And kind of cover it with some of the yellow. So I've got nice coverage on my brush. And then I'm just going to kind of add that pigment here. Add a concentration of that yellow. And clean my brush. So you can see that water is starting to take that pigment, right? And I think this practice specifically, this wet on wet practice, is such a mindful art practice because it does force us to be present, right? Focused on what's in front of us. And it can feel like a meditation in a way because you're not only slowing down, but focusing on like watching that pigment spread. I'm not going to say how many times I have gotten lost on watching videos of people mixing paint. And there's something soothing about watching that paint move, right? And so it can feel soothing to add that pigment and watch that water take the pigment and watch that pigment move, right? So I've got some yellow here. I'm going to add a little bit of purple to my painting here and do the same thing. Just kind of do a little tapping, a little stroke, some strokes. Clean my brush. So I've still got a lot of water on my painting here. So my next one that I'm going to do is take my saran wrap, my cling wrap. And so I've just got a little square here, not a big piece. I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen because it's clear, but it's just a small piece of the cling wrap. And what I'm going to do, this is the most technical part of the whole thing. We're just going to scrunch it. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. We're scrunching it so there's a lot of wrinkles in there. And then what I'm going to do is just kind of press it into my watercolor painting. Yep. And I'm just going to let it stay there. What I'm going to do is just have something a little heavy to place on top of it. So I've got an eraser. I'm just going to set it on top to hold that saran wrap still. So it can dry and I can pull it off. And again, we're not leaving these on there forever, right? We're not leaving them on for days. We're leaving them on until it dries and then we can take them off for sure. And you can see hopefully already with the rice and the salt, you can see how it's drying faster than the original one we did that was just the pigment and the water with no additives, right? All right, so let's try our alcohol now, our rubbing alcohol. So I'm going to take my round brush, I'm going to get it nice and wet, and again, paint with water first. We're not wanting the running water again, we're just wanting enough water to kind of pull our pigment. I'm going to get my brush wet, and I'm going to do an orange to start. Get my brush nice and covered in the pigment and add the color. Yeah. And again, you can see like the pigment that I'm using is I'm not blending a whole lot of colors, but I am thinking about what colors I'm using to add together. I'm just kind of really just adding pigment to the water, letting the water do all the work for me. So I've got some orange to start. I'm going to add in some green. Hopefully you're having some fun picking out your colors for this as well. Um, and you may find, again, you may find that you can see like some of the water is pooling. So I've got some blending. My water is taking that pigment, but some of the water is a little is starting to dry a little bit because there's not a lot of water carrying it. And so again, one of the things we can do is take our brush, or if you have a dropper, just add a little water to that surface with no pigment. And you can see how it's starting to pull. I'm going to add a little blue, I think, to kind of finish this. Okay. And so to do the alcohol, the rubbing alcohol, and again, we're using just regular rubbing alcohol that you can get at like Walmart or the dollar store, just regular isopropyl alcohol. It doesn't matter the percentage. I've got 91% here, but you can do the 70 or 75, whichever type you have is good. That rubbing alcohol, I'm just going to kind of pour a little bit into a container, not a whole lot, just a smaller container. And then either take a brush or a dropper, and I'm going to use a dropper just so we can kind of see the difference, and just pick up a little bit of that alcohol either in the dropper on your brush and just drop it onto what we just painted. Hopefully you're seeing, as you're doing the dropping, you're seeing how that alcohol is interacting with that water, and you're seeing this interesting design that's showing up. Let's say over here with my salt, I've got a lot of water pooling here, and maybe I want less water there. So one of the things that I'll do is I'll take my brush and kind of pinch it, squeeze it to get the water off, and then just go in there and tap it with my brush, and it soaks up that water, and I can tap it on my paper towel or rag, soaks up some of that water. Another thing that you can do is if you have a paper towel, if you're using a paper towel, you can just take your paper towel and tap it. It does the same thing the brush does. It kind of soaks up some of that extra water, so you don't have as much there. So again, soaking up that water, you can do it with like a paper towel or with a brush, a dry brush, and then just tap it on your paper towel or rag to get it off the brush. So all of these that we've just done today, it's just a few ways to kind of play around with watercolor to get different textures, to get different shapes, designs. It can really add to an abstract painting. We're going to be actually doing an abstract painting together. So we'll be thinking about some of these techniques that we learned in our last session and this session, what we can bring in to create our abstract painting. But I think it's important to kind of walk through some of the different techniques that you can do and kind of play around with that, so you can kind of see what process might be fun and what you could combine. Maybe using sand as a different texture. Maybe you want to try sugar instead of salt, or use yarn instead of rice. It's kind of fun to think about. Maybe I want to use a piece of lace this time instead and see how that turns out. I don't know how it'll turn out, but that's kind of a fun little experiment that you can do. And this type of watercolor really does lend itself to play and experimenting, right? And I know play is not a word we typically associate with adults, but the truth is there's so much enjoyment that we can get from just playing around with these different techniques and processes. And hopefully as these dry, You can kind of knock off that salt, brush off the salt, the rice, peel that saran wrap up. Spices, that would also be just like an interesting thing to try. Different spices to see how it interacts with the pigment. It could also, with spices, like if you're using something like turmeric, that could help change the color too. And so that would be a fun experiment to kind of think about what all things you can bring in to affect the painting and get a really interesting design. If any questions come up, again, always feel free to email us at our contact@Mather email or message us on our Facebook page. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Happy painting. We'll see you soon.